Like I said, June of 1872, Companies B and C of the 6th Infantry were ordered up here to basically find a place to put a post, a fort. And they came up, took a look around, and if you just notice this area here, this bluff is just perfect. I mean, you look out and you see the panoramic view all the way around, like a perfect 360. So they came, they said, okay, we'll put it up here. Now, this fort was originally called Fort Mckeen, after Colonel Boyd Mckeen. He was a Union officer during the Civil War, and he ended up getting killed at the Battle of Cold Harbor. So, in deference to him, they named this post after him to start with. The main purpose of this post was at that particular time, the Northern Pacific Railroad was coming through the North Dakota. You know, in the late, about that time, there was big railroad boom all over the country, and Northern Pacific, of course, wanted to get in on the action, money-wise. But they were being attacked by the Sioux at that time. And the Sioux, again, you know, were kept getting pushed westward just for development and many different reasons, and they didn't much care for the railroad coming in, taking the land, so they were attacking railroad crews. So the infantry's purpose was to help protect them. So they came up, and the first thing they would have done is put up your 3 blockhouses that we see here. And these, although these aren't original structures, they are exact replicas of what the blockhouses would have looked like. These were reconstructed in the 30s. When the CCC came into the park and rebuilt these. You see 3 on the edge here. What they also built up, because the military at that time is always concerned about defense, we also had a palisade, or a wall. The palisade or the wall ran between these 2 blockhouses and those 2 blockhouses. In fact, if you step over here, you can almost see where the fence stood. Sometimes you see the different coloration a little bit in the grass. So that's where it stood. Now, that particular fence was basically cottonwood. If you know anything about cottonwood, it's very kind of cheap wood, rots very easily. And up here on this bluff, with the wind and the weather that you get, the palisade did not last long. It ended up being more trouble than it was worth because it was constantly rotting. They had to basically work all day to just keep it up and fix it all the time. So the fence was only up about a year. Now, the infantry kind of had a problem. They were asked to protect the railroad, but infantry are foot soldiers. So they'd be down, maybe on patrol with the railroad. Native Americans ride in on their horses, do their attack or whatever, and ride away. Okay, now that leaves the infantry standing there. You can't chase down a horse. So they told Congress, we need some help out here on the plains because, you know, we just can't chase. It's the plains, it's wide open, miles and miles of country. We can't chase down the Native Americans. So by act of Congress in 1873, which is actually the next year, they commissioned the cavalry to come up to this post also. And the cavalry at that time, Custer was down south with his 7th Cavalry aiding in reconstruction, and he was ordered, you're going to come up to the plains, up to Fort Abraham Lincoln, because the name had since changed. It changed from Fort Mckeen to Fort Abraham Lincoln, and he was to come up here and assist out the infantry. So he came up in 1873. So important note we always make is this infantry post was up about almost a year before the cavalry ever came. And of course, when the cavalry came, Custer had many supplies shipped in and everything to help build his bigger post down there. But these guys really had to rely on a lot of what was around here. In fact, when they built the 4 officers' quarters, which if you walked along, you would see 4 officers' quarters, and they kind of curve around in like a crescent shape. They basically had a cottonwood frame with paperboard walls. Very thin walls, to where if you're in there and you're gesturing or whatever, you can literally punch right through these walls. But again, they wanted them up quickly with the materials that they happened to have around. And pretty much that's the way a lot of the buildings were put up. In fact, if you imagine how cold it would have been. Because up here in the winter, I mean, it can get 30 below sometimes, you know, and with that wind blowing, it's been 50 below wind chill before, you know, so you imagine, you know, on average, it's going to be below zero many days during the winter. You just imagine how cold that is when you have nothing but very thin walls.
Yeah.
So needless to say, life up here was pretty rough. If you walked further along the trail, what they also had up here was a pretty huge commissary where they kept their dry foods.
Mm-hmm.
So, and built, you had 120 men and maybe about 7 officers. So the 4 quarters they built, they would have had buddy up in them. You know, not every officer would have their own quarters. They'd have to share. Now, officers, of course, when they're assigned to a post, bring their families. So contrary to sometimes what people think is that it was just, you know, army or just men out on a post, but they actually had women and children out here as well, because an officer would have brought his family with. And right here, we see those officers' quarters, as I was saying, and they do go around kind of in a crescent. Now you'll notice those foundations. People think that they're part of the building, but they actually aren't. Those foundations were put up again in the 30s when the Civilian Conservation Corps came in, and besides building the blockhouses, they also made the markers for where all the buildings once stood.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Libby Custer writes in her book that when they ended up coming, and she would come up to visit her friends, and she'd see their what she considered very shabbily built quarters.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, she compared them to basic day labor quarters. Now, there was an old road also that ran right here in front. Well, it wasn't an old road then. Now it's an old road, of course, but the little wagon tracks we see, crescent-shaped again. We believe it to have run in front of the officers' quarters, and this is just from researching maps and whatnot.
Uh-huh.
And then coming around, and it probably came around, my guess, past the commissary too, simply because for supplies. We are walking along what was once the parade ground. And I always say, you know, it is so fabulous that we have this sidewalk up now so people can kind of get a sense as they're walking. And it's great because it's handicapped accessible and it's wonderful. It brings people up to the post, and I wouldn't not have it. But at the same time, when you have the sidewalk in, it can sometimes skew a little bit your imagination of how things stood. But so if you just imagine that this sidewalk wasn't here and you're actually walking on just this huge field of grass, that would have been the parade ground.
Yeah.
Now, the question is, what is there to do on a prairie? Because during this time, and it was called the Indian Wars, you had re-enlisters from the Civil War, and then you had volunteers who probably came out to the prairie because it was viewed as a romantic place full of adventure. I'm sure they had dreams that they would come out here and, you know, fight the quote-unquote red man and be victorious and run around in drills and just have a blast. But they came out here, and what did they have to do? Cut trees, haul out a lot of water, go out and do digging, you know, go out and fix fences. And so basically a lot of the glory they imagined was basically just a lot of hard work. You know, you sun up, sun down, you're working hard. Probably no different than they would have worked if they had lived on a farm, you know. So needless to say, I bet a lot of hopes were dashed when they came out here. Not to say that it wasn't dangerous. In addition to, you know, that we were basically at war. The Sioux were at war with the government, so they ran into, you know, if you go off the post too far, you could be ambushed. In fact, there was about a mile north of here, there was a little skirmish called the Woodcutter Skirmish. A patrol had got out, got into some trouble, were ambushed, ended up hightailing it back here. Now, I didn't read that any people were killed, but it does show that, you know what, they could run into trouble. In fact, As the years progressed, and when the 7th Cavalry left to go to the Battle of Little Bighorn, the outlying guards on this post were attacked. And then everybody, of course, thought the whole post was going to be overrun by Indians, but it just never happened. But needless to say, it's not to say it couldn't, because you were fighting people. You were basically two sides, and you don't really much care for one another. So that's the nature of war.
Yeah.
But more often than not, though, the soldiers that didn't get to go on the campaigns ended up getting into a lot of trouble in Bismarck back then.
Mm-hmm.
Now, just a quick little history of Bismarck. It was originally called Edwinton, and they named it after Northern Pacific bigwig, as you might imagine. Northern Pacific. It was about money. Oh, let's name the town after me. So then after a while, though, they thought, well, we need to pull more people in. How can we get those German immigrants to come to Edmonton? What if we name the town Bismarck after Otto von Bismarck? That'll pull them in. So they changed the name of Edmonton to Bismarck in hopes that it would pull people into the area. There was this myth, too, that at that particular time that Otto von Bismarck was actually going to come for a visit. And so they thought, well, we named it Bismarck after him, and he'll want to come. And he ended up not coming to visit, of course, but the name stuck, and so it was called Bismarck after that. But in this particular time, it was still 1872, and we were still Dakota territory. We wouldn't become a state till 1889. So in 1872, us in South Dakota were basically Dakota territory. Needless to say, Bismarck was a railroad town. So what you're talking about is basically a town filled with bars and saloons. So if the soldiers weren't confined to post and weren't playing cards at in the barracks or hanging out here, they'd head to Bismarck. Now you get a soldier with money in his pocket after 2 months, because maybe the army was late in getting it out here, and he goes into a liquor establishment, drinks a little too much, gets in the face of a tough railroad man, probably a lot tougher than that soldier. Needless to say, down in the cemetery you'll see a lot of shot by civilians. So they didn't always stand up too well to the hardcore guys in Bismarck just across the river. In fact, they have an area in Bismarck between 3rd and 4th Street they nicknamed Murderer's Gulch, because the idea was that every night a man was killed back in the 1870s. That's not true today. Tourists always say, oh my gosh, we're staying a bit. No, that's not true today. But back then it was a pretty dangerous place. So again, in terms of something to do, unfortunately, on free time, many soldiers found themselves, I think I'm just going to go and drink a few rounds. Now later on, when Custer would get here, and some companies would ask Custer can we build a hall to perform shows, and Custer gave his okay, and the soldiers actually built a building to where they presented plays and other things to the other members of the other companies, so ended up having other forms of entertainment besides that. But again, I don't think a lot of soldiers were necessarily prepared for the isolation that coming out to the prairie would give. As we switch gears there, I was talking about the commissary back that way. This is where the commissary stood. And you see that deep depression. You're talking about a root cellar, fairly big one.
What was it?
A root cellar. That's where they would keep the food. So
okay.
Like basically a cellar, a basement. And they kept basically the dry food here. Now, as this post became larger, they would end up having herds of cattle out here. But that first winter, they had to rely on, hunting for fresh meat and getting fresh meat from Bismarck. But the commissary just kept all the dry things. And you think about dry goods like flour and coffee and sugar, and they kept a lot of what's called hardtack. Do you know what hardtack is?
No.
Okay. Imagine like a hard biscuit that is so hard, in order to eat it, you'd either have to break it or like soak it in some hot coffee for a long time before it would be soft enough to even take a bite out of. In fact, it had a nickname called Teeth Duller. and that kind of tells you right there what it was like. In fact, it also had a nickname of Worm Castle. When you leave dry food for so long, you get worms in it.
Yeah.
To the soldiers, so the worms never hurt anybody, because they would still eat it. Worms, regardless of the worms, it was still, because it lasted forever. It simply did not spoil. In fact, the stuff they used here in the 1870s was left over from the Civil War, and the Civil War was 7 years. The end of the Civil War was 7 years prior to that. So, needless to say, it wasn't. I wouldn't like it myself. I can't imagine eating it, but although I do talk to soldiers now. I talked to some Vietnam veterans who will tell me they were still using sea rations from World War II. So it kind of shows you that the Army's idea of food doesn't necessarily change that much. If it's good enough for people 20 years ago, it's good enough for you guys. So that was a commissary. Now right here, and this is one of my favorite buildings on the post. It was the post hospital. And it actually stretches from this end all the way down to the other sidewalk. And if you imagine a 2-story building, the upstairs would have been used for surgery. The main floor had 2 wards. Each of those wards could have 12 patients. So you're talking a capacity of being able to help out 24 injured people. It was the only building, of course, with indoor latrines, simply because the men were sick and couldn't be drug outside, and right behind it there in the little grove of bushes was the death house or the morgue. Because in the winter, obviously ground's too hard to dig, and they'd basically, if someone did pass away, have to, for lack of a better word, store them in the morgue till it was soft enough to go over to the cemetery and do some digging there. So that was right along here. And the things, the doctors would see would be shot wounds, a lot of illnesses. I mean, when you have at the start like 100 plus people living together in close quarters, and it's 1870 and they don't have all that, the grasp of germs and all that, you're going to get a lot of diseases that just fly through people. Pneumonia, typhoid. Kids on the post would get diphtheria. Drinking all that Missouri water, dysentery was common. As you think about the Missouri water, it's not called the Big Muddy for nothing. I mean, it's can be, and yeah, they would boil it, but basically when you would set it, even if you went down now and scooped up a bunch and you leave it set, you have to leave it set for all that sediment to sink to the bottom. But just imagine drinking that, and let's say they didn't boil it first, and they just were thirsty after a hard day's work and just reached into the barrel and grabbed some. You can imagine just how not very tasty that would be. So needless to say, the doctor saw a lot of that type of. Now, just as any other time you hear about doctors, there's, the old stories of, this doctor was nicknamed Dr. Slaughter, because he liked to amputate, and he was an old Civil War doctor or whatever. But those kind of stories, always, anytime you're talking about an old hospital, people have those types of stories running through their mind.
Grasshoppers are noisy.
They are noisy, yes. In fact, take a step into the grass a little bit further. Well, maybe they're not so bad here, but I walked across a little ways and was bombarded with about 200 of them.
Yeah.
Post, and women who would need someone to help them with childbirth, they would not go to a doctor. The doctor is going to have little, if any, experience at all helping women out. So at that particular time on posts, you still used midwives. And the midwives, and we'll come to their quarters shortly, more likely than not would be the laundresses. There. Right here on our left, we have the bakehouse. And this was indeed exactly what it sounds like. It was the bakery. And that was one of the duties that some of the men were required to come and help out and basically make loaves of bread. And the doctor had decided that fresh bread was not good for you. So any bread made here would have been racked for about 3 days before they would distribute it. Simply because the idea being that yeast was bad for you. But then if you consider hardtack, I don't know if waiting 3 days to eat bread sounds that bad when you consider 7-year-old hardtack.
Yeah.
So. And the schoolhouse basically was your all-purpose building. It was a school. It was a library. It was a meeting room. You name it. And yes, the kids on the post came, but actually the schoolhouse was used for a lot of soldiers too. Many of the soldiers at that particular time couldn't read or write. So at the very least, in the Army, they could learn to read and write. And at the same time, a lot of the soldiers, or a percentage, I'm not going to use the word a lot, I don't have an exact percentage, but there was a fair amount of immigrants as well. So you imagine coming across on the boat, you hit the shore, it's say 1873, we're in a panic, so there's no jobs to be had at all. But you got your local Army recruiter sitting there telling you as you get off the boat, hey, we got a job for you. You'll get paid, you'll get food, you'll get clothes, and you'll get shelter. All you gotta do is come on out to the prairie. You'll get $13 a month, and you'll have grand adventure. Well, they might come out here, but maybe they couldn't speak, read, or write English. Again, they would come to the schoolhouse. So it's a very important building for a lot of soldiers and young people back then. I always obsess about the school. I'm a teacher by trade, so of course I look at the schoolhouse. Right, you'll see a little mound just before that blockhouse. That's called the Lewis Mound. I bring it up simply because we're here and we can see it. It's actually a prehistoric Native American mound. They've dated back. But again, we bring it up just because you can see it so prominently right here. Right past the schoolhouse, and you'll see one down there. There's actually about 3, but you can't see the rest because they're kind of covered up by the bluffs a little bit. But that's a scout's quarters. And on a prairie fort, scouts were invaluable. In fact, when this post was first opened, the only people that had horses were the scouts. So they would take care of delivering mail, deliver messages between Fort Rice, which is south of us, back and forth, and of course do some interpretation. The scouts on this post were Arikara mostly, but there was also Sioux. Then he also had some Caucasian as well. In fact, some of the Lonesome Charlie Reynolds is a pretty well-known scout. One of Custer's favorite at one time was called Bloody Knife. And if you were going on a campaign, scouts always went with you, of course. They would not go on a campaign without scouts. They knew the area very well, and were just basically had tons of information to share. So they had 3 scouts' quarters. Now, a lot of the scouts basically used their quarters as storehouses. Many times they would just tent outside of them. They didn't much care for their quarters, but they actually did have their own quarters. And they might have had to share, but nevertheless it beats sharing with 120 other guys. Right here, you see the adjutant's office. And an adjutant was, basically mail came in, it came through his office. Probably the payroll came through his office. Paperwork, and helped with orders for the officers. So he stood right over here by the grove of trees there. Right on my left, we're going to see stretches pretty far down to the other sidewalk, is the Laundress Quarters. Sud's Row, nickname. Now, a laundress may have been someone who'd just always been in some type of maid service or something like that, but the military post decided that they needed laundresses on posts. So they said to the ladies, we will give you a place to stay and we'll feed you. We won't pay you though, but you don't have to worry about that because you'll charge the soldiers money to do their clothes. Now, a good laundress earned about $19 a month because she charged soldiers to do their laundry. And you couple that with, say, a soldier who was making $13 a month, maybe 13 minus $1 for the veteran fund, minus this, minus that. And it wasn't unusual for a laundress to marry a private and then they'd move into the quarters because there was about 4 or 5 apartments in this quarter. And then pooling that money together, that's not a bad living. Now, I always say I never liked the laundress's job. I can't imagine doing laundry all day, old-fashioned way, wringing out lye soap. And you imagine the hands of a laundress. A 20-year-old woman probably had the hands that looked like an 80-year-old woman, simply because of this. When the cavalry post came, of course, they have their own laundress quarters and their own suds row, and a lot of what I'm talking about, they, would build comparable buildings right down there. But again, there's a lot more buildings up here than you first envision there are. Now, I like to take people right here because actually I think it's one of the best views of the whole park.
Yeah.
You get just such a bird's eye view of how everything looked. Now, you notice the cavalry post would have been down there. And east of the road, imagine not all those trees necessarily there, but you would have had like a boarding house, stables, ice house, a post-trader store across the road. They would kind of been lined up. Some of the soldiers would go down to the river and have little gardens down on the river bottoms. And right across the river, just where, directly past where the jet skis and the boats are going, there was a little shanty town built called Whiskey Point. Now, it's exactly what it sounds like by its name. Soldiers just called it the Point, but its real name was Whiskey Point. So if you were a soldier and couldn't get to Bismarck, well, you certainly could ferry across the river, or in the winter, go across the river to the little shanty town of Whiskey Point. And if Bismarck was dangerous, imagine what Whiskey Point was like. So soldiers would again get themselves into some trouble when they'd head over to Whiskey Point. Maybe get shot, maybe get into fights, whatever. In 1875, during the spring thaw when the ice was breaking up, it literally destroyed the town. In fact, Libby Custer writes in her book, she writes how they could see across the river and they could see all the people in trouble and they could see people like drowning. There's nothing they could do to really help because just the nature of how they were kind of in like just a little inlet pool area and there was nothing they could do. So the Whiskey Point was up about 2.5, 3 years and it literally was destroyed by Mother Nature. So there again, the power of Mother Nature, which is kind of scary this weekend when you think about the hurricane heading towards New Orleans. So, and again, the river changes. Missouri is such a changing river with sandbars and whatnot, but it would have looked quite different, 100 years ago. So probably wider. The Heart's Mouth was up a little bit, so. But there again, you get a nice view. And you think about heading down to the river to get water and then having to wagon wheel it all the way up here too. It would have been quite the chore. You see right here, the powder magazines, and there's 3 of them. What do you think a powder magazine is used for?
To store powder?
To store powder. It's pretty obvious, exactly. They basically stored their black powder here. Now there were 2 different kinds on prairie forts, storage facilities. You had the kind where walls would be built up, so if there was an explosion, the powder would go straight up into the air. But you also had kind of a bunker style, so where if there was an explosion or whatnot, it would kind of go down, sink into the earth a little bit. And these, and you see the depression here, were bunker style at Fort Lincoln. And you really can just see kind of how it goes down a little bit. I don't know if you'll get a pretty good shot with all the nice plants, but besides powder, and of course at that particular time they had repeaters as weapons, but at Fort Lincoln they also had Gatling guns. And a Gatling gun is your basic, like a huge machine gun. It had really been used prominently in the Civil War. The nature of that type of fighting, a line of soldiers against a line of soldiers, and you basically crank this Gatling gun and it can pretty much mow everything down in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
And at Fort Lincoln, they used 1/2-inch and inch cartridges. So, and in fact, there was right across the parking lot, when you go back to your car, you're going to see a little grove of trees. Bushes, actually. That's where the Gatling gun was placed, to guard the north-northwest corridor. A lot of the commanders had some problems with the Gatling gun during this time, again, which was called the Indian Wars. No doubt it was a devastating weapon. I mean, it could just really mow down a lot of people. But then again, it had to be moved. People would go on campaigns, and this thing was heavy, and it had to have horses pulling it, and it would slow down the column. In fact, Custer did not like the Gatling gun. He thought it slowed everybody down too much, and he's been known to be on campaigns and send his Gatling gun back. He just didn't care for it. In addition to that, a lot of the commanders thought, well, the Native Americans don't fight in a way that the Gatling gun's going to be really effective, because they have more of a guerrilla type style of warfare. But nevertheless, whether you agreed with it or you didn't, it was used back during the Indian Wars. But right here, we get a nice view of the kitchen and mess room, and it would be attached next to this will be the barracks. So they're kind of all together in one area. Again, you see kind of a deeper depression. That would have been a root cellar.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that fenced-in area?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what that actually is a fairly large pit, and it's our guess that it just from its location, that it was probably kind of like a garbage pit, right off the kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
You have soapy water, whatever, old food, whatever, bottles, whatever, dump it down there.
Mm-hmm.
And there again, at the start of this post, Fort Mckeen, 120 men would be in this barracks. And again, on the edges of this would have been your your NCO's office, and then another little office. And it would stretched across. The last building here on our right is the Quartermaster Storehouse. And a quartermaster is your basic supply guy. If you're going out on a campaign and you're going to cut trees and you need something, you come to him. If you're going to go out and dig trenches for whatever reason, you're going to get your stuff from him. So without the supplies, obviously, nothing can run. So that's your quartermaster. And again, it's a fairly large building. Goes pretty much all the way over to those brick foundations there. Now, this post, the cavalry left it in 1882. And I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but at its heyday, this post had 3 companies of the 6th Infantry, 3 companies of the 17th, and 6 companies of the cavalry. So you're talking maybe about 650 men, plus everybody else that was on this post.
Mm-hmm.
So this post would have been huge. It would have been basically the size of a small town. That's at its peak. In 1882, the cavalry was left, and they went down to Fort Meade, South Dakota. So when they left down there, infantry up here said, hey, let's go down to the cavalry post and stay there. So they moved down to the barracks and the buildings of the cavalry post. Now, the hospital was literally taken down and rebuilt down there. This only stayed on for about 9 more years after that, and this whole post closed in 1891. Now, when that happened, what you basically have is a lot of leftover buildings. And yes, they did have your watchman, I guess, or landlord, or however you want to say it, someone who was assigned to watch over things, but he's not going to be able to stop people coming in, just one guy. Well, at that particular time in North Dakota, you also had a settlement boom.
Mm-hmm.
And the settlers came across the plains, and they saw all these abandoned buildings, and they thought, well, wood and nails, and that's sure better than cutting down my own trees. So all the buildings were pretty much torn down, what was left of the buildings, by settlers coming into the area.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of the end of the post. It was only up about 19 years.